Welcome to Countouts. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at limiting factors. We're going to explain exactly what it is and how it works, and we're going to explain the steps that you follow when completing a limiting factor question. If you'd like to skip right to where we do a thorough limiting factor calculation question, you'll find the timestamps in the description below where you'll see exactly where it is. All entities are limited in their capacity, either for producing goods or providing services. There is always one resource that is most restrictive. That is the limiting factor. So your job is to find what that resource is and be able to act accordingly as to which one you should produce with the limiting factor or with the limiting resource. A limiting factor is any factor that is in scarce supply and that stops the entity from expanding its activities further. It limits the entity's activities. An entity might be faced with just one limiting factor other than maximum sales demand. And when we say maximum sales demand, obviously you cannot sell to unlimited customers. You'll have a limited number of sales demand. So that is always a limiting factor. But we are saying that an entity might be faced with just one limiting factor other than the sales demand that I've just mentioned, other than the maximum sales demand. But there might also be several scarce resources, with two or more of them putting an effective limit on the level of activity that can be achieved. Now, the question we're going to look at when we do the calculation of a limiting factor, we're going to be doing it with one limiting factor. If you would like to check out the one with several limiting factors, you'll find the link to that lesson as well in the description below. It is assumed in limiting factor analysis that management would make a product mix decision or service mix decision based on the option that would maximize profit, and that profit is maximized when contribution is maximized, given no change in fixed cost expenditure incurred. So what we are saying here is that the management will make a decision based on the fact that there is a limiting resource. They will make a decision that will provide the highest level of profit. Okay, so you're using scarce resources, but you want to say which product should I produce more of because of the limiting factor that will result in me getting the highest level of profit. So that is in essence what the limiting factor analysis does. Here are some basic notes on the limiting factor. And if it's your first time looking at the limiting factor, these notes will really help you and enhance your knowledge of limiting factors. Examples of limiting factors include sales demand and production constraints. Labor can be a limiting factor. This limit may be either in terms of total quantity or of particular skills. With materials, there may be insufficient available materials to produce enough units to satisfy sales demand. With manufacturing capacity, there may not be sufficient machine capacity for the production required to meet sales demand. So these are examples of limiting factors. Now, as we continue with the notes, the limiting factors assumptions that we are making, or when we are doing the analysis, in limiting factor decisions, we generally assume that fixed costs are the same whatever product or service mix is selected, so that the only relevant costs are variable costs. So when you're dealing with a limiting factor question, you will note that the only relevant costs here are variable costs, because we are assuming here that fixed costs will stay the same whatever product or service mix you choose to go with. When there is just one limiting factor, the technique for determining the contribution maximizing product mix or service mix is to rank the product or service in order of contribution earning ability per unit of limiting factor. And that is very important. And you may not understand what this means and what it's saying, but you'll understand when we go through the example just now. But what it's saying here is that the technique for determining the contribution maximizing product mix or service mix, meaning the one that will provide the highest level of contribution. So if you have a limiting factor, you want to see how much contribution is my products providing me per unit of limiting factor. Contribution will be maximized by earning the biggest possible contribution per unit of limiting factor. Okay, that is also very important. It ties up with what we've just said. The limiting factor decision therefore involves the determination of the contribution earned per unit of limiting factor by each different product. So we're going to take each single product that we have or that we produce, and we're going to see how much contribution per unit of limiting factor is that product giving me. And you're going to rank them and see which one is giving you the highest contribution per limiting factor. And the one that gives you the highest contribution per limiting factor will be your first priority. That's the one that you will produce as many as possible that you can produce with the limiting resource. And then you produce the second one with the second highest contribution per limiting factor, and so forth. And you'll see now how that works with the help of an example. If the sales demand is limited, the profit maximizing decision will be to produce the top ranked products up to the sales demand limit. So once you've ranked the products according to which one gives you the highest contribution per limiting factor, you want to produce that one first, like I've just mentioned. And if the sales demand is limited in that case, obviously if you can produce all of the highest ranking product, then produce that one until you've completed producing that one, and then you move to the second one, which gives you the second highest contribution per limiting factor. That's what we are saying here. So what are the steps that you follow when answering a limiting factor question? Well, here they are. The first one is to confirm that the limiting factor is something other than the sales demand. Remember, sales demand, you may be told that we are assuming that we'll be able to sell 10,000 units, for instance. That is the limiting factor in itself, that we are only able to sell 10,000 units. But you need to confirm, of the resources that you have, are we limited? Are we limited in the number of resources that we can use? Okay, so we need to confirm that the limiting factor is anything than the sales demand, which will be obvious. Okay, the sales demand is always a limiting factor in our questions. Step 2 is identify the contribution earned by each product per unit of limited resource. Okay, so that's the second step. Once we've identified the limiting factor, the second step is to identify what contribution we earn by each product per unit of limited resource, as we explained also in the previous slide. And step 3 is to prioritize the production of the product with the higher contribution per unit of limiting factor and determine the budgeted production and sales. Okay, so that's the last step. You prioritize the one which gives you the highest contribution per unit of limiting factor, and then you move on to the next product. And then once you've done that, you now determine or you calculate the total budgeted production and sales based on your rankings. Okay, now let's look at an example and explain exactly how we go about it and how we follow these steps. We are told that Villa makes two products, Malva pudding and Sago pudding. Unit variable costs are as follows, and we are given the variable costs per unit of the two products. And then we are also told that the sales price is 140 Rand per unit of Malva pudding and 110 Rand per unit of Sago pudding. During May, the available direct labor is limited to 8,000 hours. Sales demand in May is expected to be as follows, and we're given the sales demand. And you can see what I meant when I said that the sales demand is usually a limiting factor. We are limited to selling 3,000 units of Malva pudding and 5,000 units of Sago pudding. So that is the limiting factor with regards to sales demand. Okay, we are asked now to determine the production budget that will maximize profit, assuming that fixed costs per month are 200,000 Rand and that there is no opening inventory of finished goods or work in progress. Now we have to first determine what the limiting factor is. Remember the steps that we follow. The first step is to confirm that the limiting factor is something other than the sales demand. Obviously, we know the sales demand is the limiting factor, but now we have to determine, are the resources we are using, are any of them a limiting factor? Well, we were also told here that during May, the direct labor is limited to 8,000 hours. So that could be a limiting factor, but we need to determine it. So how do we go about determining that? Well, the first thing that we do is to calculate how many labor hours per unit does Malva pudding use and does Sago pudding use. Firstly, we are told that the direct labor is 30 Rand per hour, and Malva pudding needs to use 60 Rand of direct labor for each unit, and Sago pudding uses 30 Rand for direct labor of each unit. Now we need to determine how many labor hours does Malva pudding need and how many labor hours does Sago pudding need. So what are we going to do? We're going to take the amount that Malva pudding needs to produce each unit, which is 60 Rand per unit of direct labor hour. Okay, and we know that each labor hour is 30 Rand. So what do we need to do? We need to take the 60 Rand which Malva pudding needs for each unit divided by the 30 Rand per hour. okay, and it gives us 2 labor hours per unit. That's for Malva pudding. And then for Sago pudding, we do the exact same thing. We take the 30 rand that it needs for each unit, divided by the 30 rand per hour of direct labor, and it gives us 1 labor hour per unit. Okay, so now we know that Malva pudding needs 2 hours for each unit, and Sago pudding needs 1 hour for each unit. Now we need to see how many units does each product need to produce, or what is the sales demand. Well, the sales demand for Malva pudding is 3,000 units, and that's what we're given, and the sales demand for Sago pudding is 5,000 units. Okay, now that we know that, we need to now determine how many hours does each unit need. Okay, so the sales demand for Malva pudding is 3,000 units, so we'll just multiply the 3,000 units by 2 labor hours per unit, and it gives us 6,000 labor hours needed for Malva pudding. And we do the same for Sago pudding, and we see that the labor hours needed is 5,000. So the total labor hours that we need to produce Malva pudding and Sago pudding, according to the sales demand, will be 11,000 hours. We need 11,000 hours to produce all the units of Malva pudding and Sago pudding. Now you can see from this that we have a limiting factor. We know that the labor hours available is 8,000, okay, because we are told here that during May the available direct labor is limited to 8,000 hours, and we need 11,000 hours to produce all the units of Malva pudding and Sago pudding according to the sales demand for May. Okay, so we have a limiting factor, which is the direct labor hours. Now we have just completed step one. Step one was to identify that the limiting factor is anything other than the sales demand. So we have identified that the limiting factor is the direct labor hours. So from this, you can see that we have a shortfall of 3,000 hours. We need 11,000 hours, but we only have access to 8,000 hours. So we have a shortfall of 3,000 hours. So obviously, like we've already mentioned, the labor is the limiting factor on production. Now we need to move to step two. What does step two require from us? It says identify the contribution earned by each product per unit of limited resource. Okay, so we need to identify how much contribution each unit is producing per unit of labor hours, because we know that labor hours is the limiting factor. So let me remove that. So I need to get the contribution for each unit of Malva pudding and each unit of Sago pudding. So obviously we have the selling price per unit of each of the two products, and we have the variable cost which we are given here. So I just take the selling price for Malva pudding, we're told is 140 rand, and for Sago pudding we're told is 110 rand, and the variable cost for Malva pudding is 80 rand. How did I get that? I just added the three variable costs which were given for Malva pudding, and the same for Sago pudding. I added the three and we get the variable cost. So we take the selling price minus the variable cost per unit, and it gives us the contribution per unit. For Malva pudding, it's 60 rand, and for Sago pudding, it's 40 rand. Now remember, this is the unit contribution, right? For each unit, Malva pudding is giving us more than Sago pudding, but that doesn't mean we need to produce more of Malva pudding. The issue here with limiting factor is to find what the contribution per unit of limited resource is. What is our limited resource? Our limited resource is labor hours. How many labor hours does Malva pudding need for each unit produced? Well, Malva pudding needs 2 hours as we had initially calculated, and Sago pudding needs 1 hour. Remember, we calculated it before. For Malva pudding, we took the 60 rand divided by 30 rand, and for Sago pudding, 30 rand divided by 30 rand. So we have the labor hours per unit of the two products. Now, how do we get the contribution per unit of limited resource? Well, we know that the limited resource is labor hours, so we're going to take 60 rand divided by 2, and it will give us contribution per unit of limited resource. And we do the same thing for Sago, 40 rand divided by 1, and it will give us 30 rand contribution per labor hour for Malva pudding and 40 rand for Sago pudding. And you can see here things have changed. Before, we had a unit contribution of 60 rand for Malva pudding, which is higher than the unit contribution for Sago pudding. But you can see here the contribution per labor hour is 30 rand for Malva pudding and 40 rand for Sago pudding. So you can see that Sago pudding has got a higher contribution per labor hour. So we have just done step 2. Step 2 required us to rank them. Step 2 required us to get the contribution per unit of limited resource, which was labor hour, and we have just done that. So we know that Sago pudding provides us with a higher contribution per labor hour than Malva pudding. So what does this mean? Well, here's a note for you. Although Malva pudding has a higher unit contribution than Sago pudding, Sago pudding earns 40 Rand contribution per labor hour, while Malva pudding earns 30 Rand contribution per labor hour. Sago pudding, therefore, makes more profitable use of scarce resource and should be manufactured first. So what we are saying here is the one which gave you the highest contribution per limited resource, and in this case being labor hour, that will be the one we'll produce first until we can fill our sales demand, and then we'll move on to the second product. Okay, so we'll produce Sago pudding first and then Malva pudding next. Now, what is the third step that we follow? We are told to prioritize the production of the product with the higher contribution per unit of limiting factor and determine the budgeted production and sales. Okay, so we're going to prioritize Sago pudding, obviously, like we've just mentioned, because it gives us the higher contribution per limited factor, which is the labor hours. So if we produce Sago pudding first, what do we need? Well, you can see what we had initially calculated. Labor hours needed to produce all the units we need to sell for Sago pudding. We need 5,000 labor hours. So we're going to use 5,000 labor hours first to produce all the units we need for Sago pudding, and then whatever is remaining we will use for Malva pudding. So let's remove the shortfall and let's put the labor hours usage. Sago pudding will use the 5,000 hours, and we know the available labor hours is 8,000 hours. So 8,000 minus 5,000 hours used by Sago pudding, we're only left with 3,000 units. That means we'll use the 3,000 which is remaining for Malva pudding. I hope you're following along well. What we have noticed here after our calculations is that Sago pudding will provide us with the higher contribution per unit of limiting factor, which is the direct labor, and that means we'll use as many labor hours as we need to produce all the units that we need for Sago pudding, and then the remaining hours will be catered for Malva pudding. Okay, so now that we know how many hours each product will use, we can create a table, and you can see from this table here is a simple table. Yours doesn't have to be the same like this one, it can be a bit different, but it will still do the job. So the product here is Sago pudding and Malva pudding. We need to now put the hours available. Remember, the hours available for each unit is the 5,000 hours for Sago pudding and 3,000 hours for Malva pudding that is remaining. And we have just put them down. Remember, Sago pudding is our priority here because it gave us a higher contribution per limiting factor. And then how many production units will we be able to produce for Sago pudding? Well, we needed 5,000 labor hours for us to produce 5,000 units of Sago pudding. So we'll just put the 5,000 units so that we are able to produce all the units that we need for Sago pudding. And then we only have 3,000 hours left for Malva pudding. So how many units can we produce with 3,000 hours? Well, we have 3,000 labor hours divided by 2 hours per unit. Remember, we had calculated initially. Malva pudding needs 2 hours to produce 1 unit. So 3,000 labor hours divided by 2 hours per unit gives us 1,500 units that we can produce for Malva pudding because of the limiting factor. So the 1,500 units, we put it there. And then once we have that, we need now to see what is the contribution per unit. Remember, we had calculated the contribution per unit, not the contribution per limiting factor, but the contribution per unit. Remember this calculation we have done before. We have the unit contribution. That is what we need, and that's what we'll focus on. Some students usually make the mistake of using the contribution per labor hour, and that is wrong. You're supposed to use the unit contribution, okay, because that's what contribution you'll get for selling each unit. So for Malva pudding, it's 60 Rand, and for Sago pudding, it's 40 Rand. So we'll put them down accordingly. And once you've done that, you just multiply your production units by your contribution per unit, and it will give us the total amount we will receive. And you can see for Sago pudding, we'll get 200,000 Rand, and for Malva pudding, we'll get 90,000 Rand. We just took the production units times the contribution per unit. And you can see that our total contribution we are receiving is 290,000 Rand. And once we have the contribution that we'll receive, we just need to put down the fixed costs. We are told here that we assume that fixed costs per month are 200,000 Rand. So we need to put down the 200,000 Rand. And once we have done that, we can get our profit, which is the total contribution of 290,000 Rand minus the total fixed costs of 200,000 Rand. And it gives us a profit of 90,000 rand. And that is how you do a limiting factor question, where you calculate the contribution maximizing production mix. I hope it has made sense. I hope you have gained value from this lesson, and I hope you are able to follow along well. If you have gained value from this lesson, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it to those you think it might help. Till next time, cheers.